on our Repairs Online Technical Alpha. So if you could just take me on to the next slide, Neil. So I'm Fraser Trickett, I'm from City Lincoln Council and I'm product owner for this round. And we're working with Greenwich, Southwark and South Kesteven District Council. And we've kind of hit the ground running in trying to understand the technical barriers and opportunities for us to be developing a repairs online solution. So working with Unboxed, we're kind of approaching this to understand what the options are to do this. And we're focusing on two channels, and that is if we can help evolve the market by working with suppliers and perhaps get them to change and update their products to fit in line with what we've identified to be a really good common service pattern, or whether we actually look to disrupt that market and do something a bit more radical to change that. So that would be more looking at how we develop our own product on there or create common APIs that can interface back into some of these big player systems. Next slide, please, Neil. So we've had a busy couple of weeks. We haven't let the fact that we can't kind of see each other try and stifle our creativity in this. So we've been putting technology to its maximum capabilities with all sorts of things. So what we've been trying to do is get some interviews in with suppliers, which we'll come on to in a bit of detail in a moment, and talking to the partners and inviting other councils to get involved so we can understand how they operate their repair service at the moment and their technical setup. If you haven't done so already, we'd really like you to fill the survey in, which I'm sure we can share at the end of this, or you can visit our website and follow that from there. We've identified a primary integration point for a product, and that's looking at what is the best point for us to start jumping into this as a transaction. We've got a couple of ideas up in the air at the moment, and again, we'll come into those in the detail of the presentation, and also try to understand how a common API might work for us, which has been quite interesting. And at the moment, suppliers have been really positive and working with us on this. And we've also reviewed the Hackney Razor Repair code base, as they've already done quite a bit of work around this, and we felt it was good to look to our colleagues at another council to see some best practice being carried out there. So Michelle, I'll hand over to you at that point.
Thank you, Fraser. Neil, could you go to the next slide, please? Cheers, thanks. So yeah, we've continued with our research. So in this sprint, so the last 2 weeks, we spoke to one large supplier, Northgate, and we also spoke to a smaller supplier who kind of offers a solution whereby residents can report a repair online. That's Active Housing. They mainly work with housing associations, but it was interesting to see what their product does and how they've kind of approached some of the issues that we're looking at. We had a conversation with one of our partner councils as well, with South Kesteven, with their IT team to run it by the housing IT guys to kind of get their thoughts on the prototype, how feasible they think it would be with their existing systems. And we also had a conversation with a housing association as well, who this was somebody who reached out to me after seeing us promoting the council survey and said they wanted to share some ideas as well about an online repair service that they've developed with another supplier, and they're using Capita. So we had a kind of demo of that and had a look at kind of how easy or difficult it was for them to set their system up. And we've published that council survey, as Fraser mentioned. And of course, Fraser, I wasn't going to wait until the end. So there's the link. If you are a council watching this, I would really appreciate it if you could go on there and just tell us a little bit about how you handle and manage repairs at the moment. That would be really helpful. As we go through the rest of this show and tell, we will kind of touch on things we've learned from some of these conversations, but we're still quite early on and we're pulling together insights from both the conversations we had in this sprint as well as the previous sprint. And we've got some more interviews lined up with suppliers for the next 2 weeks as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, I wasn't really sure what to call this one, data galore. So I guess in a nutshell, like when you first start working on a project, you hear about kind of all the different things that need to be considered, and it can be quite difficult to kind of drill down sometimes and identify, look, what is the main thing we need to focus on? When it comes to repairs, it is quite complex offering an effective repair service. On the surface, it might seem quite simple, but of course, for that to work, data has to be pulled from lots of different systems at different parts of the journey. So you've got, for example, location data. So that's both useful from an eligibility point of view, you know, is this a resident who's actually in a council property, but also to check availability for a repairs operative to go out. So sometimes you might just have some repairs operatives who might just work in I don't know, in the north of the city, for example. And of course, they need that information when they actually go out on site as well. There's the details of the repair. So whether this is online or, as it is in a lot of cases now, people ringing up, there needs to be some kind of diagnosis of what that repair is. So what trade is it? What kind of tradesperson needs to go out, a plumber or a carpenter? And what is the complexity of the job as well? So if it's just maybe, I don't know, fixing a leaky tap, that might be a bit quicker than replacing a whole toilet, for example. And that will determine how long the appointment needs to be scheduled for as well. And then there's other eligibility criteria as well. So as you know, checking whether the resident is in a council-owned property is one thing, but when it comes to reporting repairs online, we also need to look at the kind of I guess the urgency of that repair. If it is really urgent, we don't necessarily want to encourage residents to report it online. In that case, they should call up. And then outside of that, kind of, there's a lot of other things as well. So once a repair has been reported and an appointment has been booked, the repairs operative needs to make sure they have the contact details of the resident. They need to make sure they're aware of any vulnerability associated with that resident or any additional needs they may have, such as an interpreter. Any cautionary flags, you know, I mentioned this last week, but there's other information that an operative might need to know ahead of time when they go, before they go out on site. For example, is there a dangerous dog on the site? And information about the property as well. Is there anything they need to be aware of? You know, they're going to go and fix the bathroom and maybe part of the bathroom has asbestos. This is something they need to know ahead of time. And then there's also stuff around finance and billing and all the kind of back-end processes as well. I think from our point of view for this service, if you look on the kind of right-hand side of the screen here, you've got, you know, that the resident reports the repair and books an appointment, and that's what we're focusing on. All the other stuff that happens behind the scenes, such as making sure the operative has those cautionary flags and any other stuff like that, that already happens now. And systems have already been built and integrated to provide that data. It varies across different councils how integrated they are, but there is kind of something that happens now. So we're just mainly focusing on that top bit. How can we make it easy for a resident to actually report a repair and book an appointment? So we'll go to the next slide, please. So we've started to map out kind of how this system would look. Now I realise this is probably going to look quite small on some of your screens. I've included a link there at the bottom so you can go and have a look on this Miro board where we've kind of literally mapped every page in the prototype, and beneath it we've identified what data we will need to pull from other systems and what data we might need to send that the resident has provided back to a system. And this has helped us just to identify, look, where are the main interactions between the front-end service, so the user interface, and the systems that sit behind it. And we are also, from that, we were also able to kind of start to add some questions on there. So when we were speaking to suppliers and council IT teams, we showed them the prototype and we did ask them, you know, about, you know, what do you think in terms of how would this work with your existing systems or products? And they did have a couple of questions. So one of them was, when a resident reports a repair, they can also upload photos and notes. So the council IT teams were interested in finding out, well, where would they go? Because their current housing management systems can't necessarily, you know, process and take that data in. And actually, it's not necessarily for that system, it's for the operative to check beforehand, and they might not have access to the housing management system. And then there were other questions as well about, we know that at the end of the journey, a resident is provided with a reference number. This is useful for them if they want to track the repair at any point. So they might report it online, but then want to call up to check on something, and they will need to give a reference. And we're thinking about, could that reference be the same number that is generated, which is called a kind of a job number? And at what point does that need to be generated in the system? Because we think it might have some dependency on scheduling. So before an appointment can be scheduled, a works order has to be generated. So it's kind of trying to figure out at which point is differently data needed from different systems. If we go to the next slide, please. But then we're thinking, the kind of minimum data that's needed for this service to work, and the kind of key points where we need to interact with existing systems are these. So on the resident side, they need to provide their postcode, and they need to provide enough information about their repair to identify, one, the trade, so which tradesperson will have to go out, and two, the complexity. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But this is basically to make sure that they are presented with a set of appointments that will be relevant to their kind of repair. And the postcode is just to check that they are actually in a council property. On the system side of things, there's a couple of key pieces of information. So from the housing management system, we need to be able to take a postcode that a resident has entered and cross-check that to make sure it is a council property, and present back some property addresses that the resident can then select and say, yes, that's where I live. We also need to generate that kind of job and works order number, which is something I mentioned before. We know this is what the housing management system generates, and it links through to the scheduling systems and basically kind of allows a lot of other things to happen. So we just need to figure out at what point does that number need to be generated so all the other steps can happen as well. And then the scheduling system, taking that information about the trade and the complexity in terms of, does this need to be a 1 hour appointment or a 3 hour appointment, needs to send back a list of available dates that the resident can choose to select an appointment. Next slide, please. So on that point around kind of type of job and complexity, the way this usually would, I guess, work to some degree is through what is called schedule of rates, so SOR codes. Each kind of repair will have an SOR code attached to it, which will help to identify what trade it is, so plumbing, and also might have a unit attached to it as well. So the unit could be time. So it's a plumbing job that's quite easy, so we would expect it to take 1 hour, and that will determine the cost. It could also have a different kind of unit. So it might not be time, it might be area, for example. So it's a tiling job and it's, I don't know, 3 walls. Again, that kind of has an impact on time and materials, and that will generate a cost. So when a resident reports their repair, we can be asking enough kind of questions to behind the scenes attach this to an SOR code, so we can see, okay, this is the tradesperson and this is the amount of time it's going to take, therefore we need to make sure we offer appointments for that tradesperson and for 3 hours instead of 1 hour. But it's not that simple, because there are thousands of SOR codes. Each council, they might have 1,000 or up to 4,000 SOR codes, but generally they will use a subset for the majority of cases. So they might, over a year, maybe use 100 or 200 SOR codes, but there might be, 5 or 6 SOR codes that are used regularly. And even within that, different councils may use different SOR codes for the same sort of repair. And then some councils have their own codes. They don't all use the actual National Housing Federation schedule of rates. Some have developed their own codes. And some of them use composite codes as well. So in some cases, a council might drill down very specifically. So a code that is I don't know, about fixing a cracked bathtub, for example, whereas another council might just use a general composite code, which is plumbing. So trying to, from the front end, allow a resident to, report their repair and link that to an SOR code is going to be quite tough to make that work for lots of different councils. So we've been thinking about kind of how we might do that. And the rather unattractive screenshot there on the right is actually where we've matched the top 50 most frequently used SOR codes in Lincoln and Southwark Council. This is just 2 councils, but only 12 of them actually match. The rest were all completely different. And we will be looking at our other partner councils' SOR codes as well, but I think it's going to probably be a similar picture. I'm going to hand over to Neil now to kind of explain what we're thinking about, how we might tackle this.
Thanks. So we've got some points there about SOR codes again that we're thinking about at the bottom of the slide there. So obviously we want this service to be kind of interoperable between different councils. One idea is to have a standardized set of codes, but judging from our kind of first look at the data, that might be quite tricky to achieve. So at the bottom there, the last bullet point is to show that we're considering allowing councils to have potentially quite an extensive set of options that they can configure behind the scenes, essentially kind of tying together where in the diagnosis flow a user can end up and which SOR code that might relate to. And it might be interesting also to think about kind of the level of granularity for each SOR code, kind of the underlying meaning of it, whether it just relates to a plumber for 1 hour or a plumber for 3 hours, and all of the different kind of time slots essentially for that work to be carried out. It's also useful for us to keep in mind that it's very often not until the tradesperson has actually visited the property and actually had a good look at the problem that a really accurate sort of final SOR code is applied to it. In the next couple of slides, I'm just going to pull out some data from the Hackney's Maintain My Home service, which has lots of similarities to our service pattern in that it's a sort of multi-step form which allows you to kind of diagnose your problem, and it might result in an SOR code.
Yeah, and
so
sorry, Neil, I was just going to mention something on that previous slide. Because of, as you said, like sometimes the SOR code, the correct one isn't diagnosed up front. And as Neil mentioned, that the operative will go on site, actually see it's something else. So one thing we were considering, I guess, was, the SOR code is mainly used as well for cost. The way it applies here is to identify trade and length of time required. So one option might be not to actually assign an SOR code at this point, but still kind of gather that information that so the right appointment can be booked.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of thinking of that as a sort of a placeholder until we know more, kind of thing. So this slide just has a few numbers in terms of the kind of diagnosis flow for the Hackney app. So there's about 90 endpoints that you can reach as a person reporting a repair in this service. And just sort of reading from left to right at the bottom here, this is supposed to represent sort of each ending in that journey. So 12 endings in the diagnosis flow actually just signpost you to call an emergency number, such as a gas leak, for instance. And then the remainder of those endings for the diagnosis flows, they result in, or they should result in, the creation of a booking if the user completes the journey and there's no kind of other issues. So I was interested to see that actually about 40% of the diagnoses don't have an SOR code associated with them, but they would have like a description just of the problem sent by the user. The remainder do have an SOR code associated with them. It was also interesting to note that out of all of those diagnoses that have an SOR code, a lot of them are shared. So this kind of ties back to that concept of maybe a placeholder SOR code that might be applied. There's certainly a difference there between the level of detail that we've seen in the spreadsheet that we mentioned on a previous slide, all of the SOR codes there, compared to just on the left-hand side of this chart. This is the number of like diagnosed problems that have the same SOR code. So there's about 15 that all relate to what looks like plumbing to me. So it's really the bath or the sink or the basin. So it's kind of interesting to think about that for our service, whether it's important to design and build into the design how the SOR codes are structured, and perhaps kind of have a hierarchical kind of relationship between them. I think Tom's going to outline some more of the research that he's been doing.
Cool, thanks, Neil. So one of the things that Fraser mentioned at the beginning was we're looking at where we could kind of master appointment data. So as things stand, what typically happens is repair is raised in the housing management system and then kind of flows to the contract management system and through to the scheduler, which kind of gives the appointment. That means potentially more integrations going on than there needs to be. So one of the things we wanted to look at was whether we could integrate directly from the public-facing service into the scheduling service, kind of get an appointment there, which is kind of the key thing that people want when they're using the online service, and then take care of everything else behind the scenes by kind of pushing things upstream. We had a chat with Corona Advanced around DRS, and they said, like, absolutely they can do that. So the functionality within DRS exists to kind of accommodate all the information that we'd need. What we found, however, when discussing it with Southwark's IT department and also with Northgate, is that doing this would probably actually break some of the other workflows around repairs. So things like kind of creating an appointment slot without a works order that comes from the housing management system might then cause problems. There's potentially issues around work order numbers being generated out of order, which could then also kind of cause issues within the database. So I think, although yes, we could do it by going to DRS or any other scheduling system first rather than the housing management system, and it would be an easier integration, it would then require us to rebuild other workflows in the repairs service to accommodate that change, and so it'd probably actually end up being more effort than it is currently. I think this is probably an example of something whereby if you were designing the system from scratch today, you would probably look to go to the scheduling system first and then kind of build out from there. But kind of we are where we are. Most systems aren't configured that way, and so we'll probably carry on looking with the idea of going to the housing management system first and then onto the scheduler. Next slide, please. Cool. We then have been looking at the feasibility of a common API. Kind of the idea around this is by making it easier to integrate different systems, it make it easier for various emerging prop tech firms kind of enter the market, and this kind of opens up possibility of, I don't know, like IoT devices raising repairs, various like chatbots, which are always really, really popular, being involved, but also kind of generally making it easier and kind of generating more competition in the market to kind of drive up the quality of products on offer. So we considered two possible approaches to this. The first is we build a connector on top of the existing APIs and web services that companies offer, which would essentially kind of abstract their API into something that's got a common basis. The second approach is we would design an API which vendors would then adopt and kind of add to their systems, either to replace their existing APIs or in addition to it. The first of these is hard technically, just because there's so many different like housing management systems and repairs management systems out there. Trying to build an API that works with all of those is just going to be like a very long-winded process. The second is potentially quite hard politically, because a lot of the big advantage that the big system vendors have is that they've got this vendor lock-in. And so creating something that makes it really, really easy to integrate with their system isn't necessarily in their best interests. In fairness to Northgate, we had a chat with their housing director. They take the position that they want to be the most open system on the market. So it isn't like a given that vendors wouldn't go for it, but I think it is a risk, and we need to kind of speak to more vendors to see whether Northgate's sentiments are replicated elsewhere. Next slide, please. So in terms of building a connector, although it's difficult, we do know that it is possible. Hackney Council have got Repairs API, which links to repairs ordering products, the Maintain My Home service that Neil mentioned, and also an internal system called Repairs Hub used by their contact centre. And that links those systems to their HMS, their contract system, and the scheduling system. Bristol City Council are partway through a migration from Civical's old product, Universal Housing, to their new one, CX. They're working with PlaceCube, who deliver a lot of their public facing services on that. And PlaceCube currently have got their system set up to integrate with both the old and the new Civica systems concurrently. Also, one of the repair system vendors we spoke to says they've got a connector that they use internally to accelerate integration with new systems clients. And so this is something they've built up over like a number of years, and that each time they've integrated with, say, like a Northgate system or a Capita system or what have you, they've kind of kept that code and reused it, and just over a long period of time, they've actually built out this kind of connector that we'd be looking for. What we kind of feel probably the best cost-benefit way of approaching this would be to do this work around like the big system vendors for like Capita, Northgate, and Civica, just because by doing it for a relatively small number of systems, you'd actually open up quite a large number of councils to a new way of working. Next slide. So on the designing the API side, HACT has been working on the UK housing data standard, which has got quite a lot of support in the sector. Primarily supports come from housing associations rather than councils, but it's also being picked up by a number of smaller suppliers that are kind of listed on the screen. The main reason they're kind of picking up is that smaller companies often want to embrace standards because it makes things more interoperable and makes the migration easier. So it's in their favour. Typically, established companies don't want to do that because, as mentioned before, it prevents vendor lock-in. So an example of this is kind of around the browser market. Way back when Internet Explorer 6 was like the dominant browser, Microsoft broke standards left, right, and centre, and people had to design their website to work with Internet Explorer rather than with HTML standards. And that was by design from Microsoft. It meant that it was harder for other people to compete. Firefox and then Google Chrome came in. They were like very clear. They were adhering to standards all the way. They kind of gained market share. Google Chrome is now like the dominant browser. But what's happening now is that Google Chrome actually regularly kind of implements things that have not been signed off by the HTML working group, and they're beginning to a certain extent to do kind of things that Microsoft were doing. And so you now have to design your browser to work with Chrome, not just with HTML. The circle of life, I guess. But on this basis, an API designed around the standard may be similarly appealing to smaller suppliers. And so if we could kind of build something that works for the larger suppliers to kind of force their hand, then there'd be a kind of a natural groundswell for like the smaller suppliers to follow suit. Okay, next slide. It's back to you, Neil.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pull out a couple of points from, again, looking at the Hackney Maintain My Home service. The first one is not so related to the API that Tom was just talking about. I'll get onto that next. This first one really is just to communicate that the way that the this diagnosis flow works, they've got a kind of a tree data structure that configures that. I imagine that they built it that way so that they could easily swap out where you end up as a resident or as someone reporting a repair as their service changed. It was quite encouraging to see that, because I think this open source code that they've released, I think there will be opportunities to reuse some of it potentially for our service pattern. So just here in the middle here, for instance, this is part of that data structure, and hopefully you can see a question about a repair there. Is there water leaking into or from the fan? And as you can imagine, if the user answers yes, then that's an emergency. So that's not something that would be handled through the app directly, and they'd be signposted to actually call emergency number. However, if they answer no, they get pointed to a page where they can input more information about the problem. But also, crucially here, that's the point where an SOR code is applied. So obviously, the system designers have decided that at that point, yes, we do know enough about this problem that we're going to actually specify which SOR code ultimately ends up in the housing management system for this particular part of the journey. So I was, as I say, I think that's encouraging to see that, because I think it'll be useful for use. Moving on to the back end in terms of how that app actually communicates through Hackney's API. Here we see a list of kind of messages that can be sent through that API, and I won't necessarily pick out all of them, but you can see that a lot of them are relevant to our service as well. Perhaps the most important one is the fourth one down there, which is the message being sent is to create a repair, and the data that's sent along with that message is a description of the problem from the user, a particular reference of the property that's being built up by the address information the user input as part of their eligibility page, some contact information about the user, optionally the SOR code, and some other information, including the priority and the estimated units. Although I couldn't actually see any part of the app where the priority or the estimated units changed. It seemed like that was just hard coded from what I saw. And at the end, yeah, that at the end is another important message as well, of course, which is booking the appointments, which in order to actually send that message, we need to supply a works order reference and begin and end date of that appointment. So that part of the app also looks like it's going to be useful for use as well, and designing our API as well.
Thanks, Neil. So just going back to kind of thinking about how the resident will actually interact with the service, there were a couple of other things we're thinking about as well. So focusing on kind of that user interface, the online repair service. We've talked a lot about kind of SOR codes and the stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes to identify the correct trades and the right appointment dates can be shown. But we just need to think about kind of, I guess, again, getting that balance right between making it relatively lightweight and easy for a resident to diagnose and, their repair. And because there's really a risk that, if we drill down too deep and ask too many questions, one, that can be very hard for the resident to use. They might not necessarily have the answers to that. And it really puts the burden on them to kind of understand maybe exactly what's wrong with that boiler, for example. And we heard that, from the research in previous phases of the project, even council customer service, when people ring up to report a repair, as they don't have, a background, they're not repairs operatives themselves, they also had trouble getting to that correct diagnosis. So we need to make sure we don't kind of recreate that difficulty for residents as well. But there's a risk that if we ask too little, ultimately a repairs person comes out, and because they didn't have the detail they needed, they've only come out for, say, a 1 hour appointment, whereas it's going to take a lot longer, and there's going to have to be another appointment booked as well. So it's kind of weighing up those two sides of, you know, making it easy for the resident, but also making sure we get enough information to provide the service that's needed. Another side of this as well is we really need to think about what happens after somebody's used our service. So again, that quote from a resident there was taken from some user research that happened in an earlier phase of the project. And just kind of, we have to be aware that this isn't replicated. We could build a really great, I guess, user-facing service. It's very easy to use. It connects with all of these different systems behind the scenes. It doesn't break anything. But at the end of the day, it could still kind of feel to a resident that once they've reported their repair, it's gone into a black hole and they don't know what's happening. So we might want to consider perhaps either expanding the prototype to look at how a resident could, for example, track a repair. So they're given a reference number instead of calling up to see what's happening with that repair. Could they do that online? We know that a really high volume of calls that go through to the council are actually chasing up repairs. So how can we reduce that? And then also thinking about, you know, is track a repair a service that's needed? Because if the resident, once they've booked a repair online, is sent all the information they need at different points, will they ever feel like they need to ring up and track it or go on a website to track it? You know, what information do they need? What emails do they want to receive or text messages? And at what points to reassure them that something's being done? So again, this is kind of in the background, we're thinking kind of more broadly how we can make that experience a little bit better for residents. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So at the beginning of the project, we kind of mapped out what our riskiest assumptions were, which kind of on this slide. So I just wanted to kind of update on where we are with those. So the first one was we can integrate with multiple housing systems and scheduling systems to deliver a better service. It seems from the work being done by Hackney and Bristol that this is possible. So that's looking good. There's a question about whether the objectives of the project are of high enough priority for councils, especially with its COVID recovery. We've had conversations with a few people on the project and very much like still in one instance, particularly champing at the bit, trying to get a better housing repairs system online. So that still looks good. I guess what we haven't necessarily done is tested that more widely outside of our project groups, and you start looking at that more. There was an assumption around suppliers being willing and motivated to enable the change. We found from like the smaller suppliers we speak to that they're like kind of very like enthusiastic about this. We've only spoken to one big supplier so far. He at Northgate, they were quite happy with it. So this also is looking good. And then we had a final one was our solution to the problem will be useful across different councils with different sizes, with different needs. I think the way we're kind of exploring that is by looking at different possible solutions. So we do have this one way of saying, okay, if we design a pattern, then that can be adopted within your existing systems. We'll be doing some work on that in the next sprint to try and identify what the costs are with that. But then if people do want to start hosting their own stuff, then potentially there's an open source system we could build for them, which they could host. And also the API is another interesting way of approaching this, letting people kind of have the infrastructure they need to let other people connect into their systems. Next slide. Cool. So at the end of sprint 2, we're halfway through the project, so I just wanted to kind of recap what we've done so far. So we've spoken to one large HMS, we've spoken to a large scheduling system supplier, spoken to 2 council IT teams, 3 smaller repair services, spoken with 1 housing association, Medway. We've created and sent out a survey to councils. We're still trying to get more people to fill that in. So if anybody can do anything to kind of like help popularise that, it'd be much appreciated. We've reviewed Hackney's code base for their report repair service, and we've also explored other report repair interfaces, Hackney, Capita and Ada and Worthing. Final one. Sorry, next slide. And yeah, cool. So the next steps we've got for the next sprint are we need to carry on promoting and analysing the survey. We have got some supplier interviews in the diary with Civica and with Housemarque. We've got some council interviews set up with Greenwich Housing IT team, and we're going to be arranging more interviews with Capita, Total Mobile, We'd like to speak to actually repairs contractors, not just kind of systems vendors. We're trying to find another scheduling system vendor to speak to. We've only spoken to Corona Advanced so far. And we'd also like to carry on speaking to smaller software vendors. So hopefully you'll be getting something set up through Tech UK to help facilitate that. We're going to carry on reviewing technical documentation. We've got some stuff through from Northgate already, but we need to kind of get more API docs from various peeps. And then finally, we need to, as I mentioned before, kind of look at establishing the costs of how much it would cost to implement this pattern in the existing system. And that's us. So I'd like to kind of hand over to you guys for any questions that you might have.
Have you spoken to Orchard about this?
Not yet. We are happy to, if anybody's got contact details with somebody at Orchard.
Hiya, Jabeen from Greenwich. In terms of the intention to speak with repairs contractors, have you started those conversations yet, or have you got any people in mind, any contractors in mind?
Yeah, we haven't started them yet, but we have been speaking to some in another project we're working on with Hackney. So we've got contacts, but more contacts is always helpful.
Okay.
I am speaking with Southwark as well, who I think Jade might be on with the call. He's helping me to speak to one or two of the contracting companies that Southwark uses.
Thank you.
Hi.
Peter?
Yeah, just one of the things that seemed to be sort of missing in one of the first slides was to do with the data that you need. One of the things that some of the larger councils do is deal with multiple contractors based on area and type of work. And is that something that you've looked at as well, being able to actually split off into different contractors, schedulers, and not just the schedulers within the councils, the authorities, the actual contractor schedulers, because in some cases they might use an internal scheduler, in some cases they might use an external scheduler used by the contractors.
It's true, we didn't really cover that, I guess, at the start of this. I think we mentioned it a little bit in the last show and tell, but it was about, so right at the beginning, you have got that kind of list of where you are asked if it's basically an urgent repair. And if it is, you see a content page with some information on what you're supposed to do, so to call up. To begin with, just because we have to start somewhere, I guess, that might be something we do for contracted out repairs as well. We might just have to do that because obviously that will vary from council to council as well about which types of repairs are contracted out. However, I think it depends on what our recommended solution is. And it also depends a bit on what kinds of systems they use. So I think that's why we're keen to speak to some of those contractors to get an understanding about their systems and how and if they integrate with the council systems all at the moment. I've definitely heard some cases from Hackney where it sounds like it's not very integrated, but it is something we want to find out more about.
Yeah, I mean, we integrate with, say, for example, Morgan Sindall's appointment system, but we also have other contractors as well. But I mean, I know when I used to work at Leeds, and they used to have a DLO, but they also used to have up to 6 Almos with up to 6 different contractors. So you've actually got quite a mixed level of of complexity there that you need to actually look at, and quite often they're either based on can be based on area or trade.
Mm.
Yeah, this is something we're looking at with another project that we're doing with Hackney, where the initial kind of version 1 of it was working with repairs that get sent to their DLO, and the second version we're now looking at is expanding that out to the various like contractors they use. Like theoretically, it shouldn't be so difficult as long as the contractors are up for it, because they operate in the same way as the DLO. They've got a contract management system, they've got a scheduling system. So like architecturally, we shouldn't really be treating them much differently than the way we do internal people, which is kind of like an extra step to work out, okay, is this repair going like internally or externally? And if going externally, what are the rules for deciding which external party it goes to?
Yep.
Yeah, I think Jide was next.
Hiya. It's actually a response to Peter's query about working with different contractors on the repairs landscape. The situation you've just described, Peter, as is the situation in Southwark. And although it hasn't happened yet, we are in the process on the project of scheduling interviews with those contractors to understand. And I think I have shared details of how the routing occurs in the scheduling with Tom and the team, with Shell. So it's something I think that, in fairness to Unbox, they have got their eye on that and they are looking at that. They have been investigating it, and we are actually, because the repairs landscape in Southwark works in very much the way you've described, it will be part of this piece of work. So I'm sure there'll be more to report at the end of the next sprint, or even during the sprint. So just watch this space, I guess.
Cool. I think Kevin was next.
Hi, all right, Kevin Worth. Just a quick question. You mentioned a lot about SORs there and the complexity that using the full volume brings along. Have you ever considered just using the ROS? The ROS is just like, sorry, the repairs ordering schedule. It's only 320 SOR codes are thereabouts, but it covers 80–90% of common repairs, but they're quite generic, like tap repair, any type of tap. But at least then you can have a non-technical person speaking to a non-technical person that can at least diagnose the trade and a hint at what the issue might be.
Yeah, and I think that's like kind of the sweet spot we want to get to on the diagnosis, is being able to say it's this trade and we think they're going to be there for roughly this length of time.
Yep.
I think like one of the risks of going too specific in the diagnosis is you're then kind of pushing all the responsibility for all diagnosis onto a resident who's probably not necessarily the best person to do it, and then send somebody out and it's like, oh, actually the thing I'm being asked to do is not what I was told I'm going to be doing in advance. And then, yeah, you get all kind of problems kind of spilling out from that.
I think we could have a look at the ROS. I've just written it down. I wasn't. Yeah, I'll look that one up.
It's good because you can link lots of different problem descriptions to a single SOR code. But at least the key thing is you're getting the correct trade there. Hopefully the van stock will be sufficient to cover, you know, the common repairs that keep coming up. But personally, I always say, raise a job with the ROS, invoice with the full. Because when your engineer's been out, they go, it's one of them, and one of them SOR codes, that's what you're going to pay me. For diagnosis, you just really need the trade and a hint at what's wrong. So, okay, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
Sweet, and I think one more question.
Yeah.
Hiya, I was just to add on to what Kevin just said there. So I was thinking about, I don't know if you mentioned this, about the NatFed schedule of rates, which, yeah, so I was just going to sort of mention that. I wasn't sure if you said that earlier and say the same thing that Kevin said. So that was it.
Yeah, I think so we were, I think we were just being a bit lazy when we were speaking. So we just kept talking about SORs, but yes, we were basing them on those, but we know that, I guess, you know, there are loads of codes. That's the problem. There are thousands, and each council will use a different subset, and then also they sometimes just have their own codes. But we've been using those as a starting point, and I think what Kevin just said, we will have a look at the ROS as well to see if that can give us a more specific subset, perhaps. Oh, we've got Kevin. Do you have another question? I know.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, okay. So this one's property related. I mean, you're looking at a property search based on a postcode, and inside the council that I'm working at, inside that postcode area, you might have properties that we own, that we rent out. We might have properties that we've sold. We might have a leaseholder who wants to try and raise a repair, and only certain ones of these properties will actually have what we call repairs responsibility.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
some of them you might want to come back and go, oh, it's the owner of flat 13 who's it's sold, who are coming to you to raise a repair. You need to be able to discriminate between the ones we should be repairing and the ones we shouldn't be.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're looking at was you type in the postcode and you get a drop down list of all the properties there which we would be responsible for repairing. And then if your property is not listed, it would either be because, as you say, you're a leaseholder, or like the tenant association has taken responsibility for those repairs from the council or something similar. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess we just need to think about how we could, where we're taking that data from them in the first place. Actually, Kevin, I hope you don't mind me asking, which council are you from?
Both Peter and I are currently working for Westminster City Council.
I was just wondering who was on the call. Jen?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Just following on from that, it may be a little bit more complicated because, say, for example, for leaseholders, they may be able to raise repairs for a communal area, say to report a repair that's required to a lift or to a heating system, but not repairs to their own property. Because so that they can report communal repairs, but not property-related repairs. So there may be that nuance there that complicates the matter.
Yeah, I think communal repairs is an entire other layer of complexity over in-home repairs. So you've got to deal with multiple people like reporting the same repair, different people describing the same location in different ways. And so you can have what looks like 3 different repairs actually being the same repair. And I think there's so much complexity in it. I think we'd be better off maybe steering clear of those for an online service for now and just focusing on the in-home repairs.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Tom, in that from all of the research gathering that we've done, it's quite clear that we're not going to be able to solve or provide a solution that solves 100% of the repair types for 100% of local authorities, and that there will be a kind of prerequisite kind of stage to this where people have to operate potentially in a certain way in order to be able to fit with this common service pattern, and that there might be some outliers in types of repairs that just don't suit this that we're proposing on here. Sorry, Kevin's got a question, I think.
Sorry, I keep coming back. I apologise for this. I was thinking about when you were talking and you showed a diagnostic tree, if you want to call it that, where it was based on words.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas obviously we live in a multilingual society at the minute. Would it be better to consider going down the photograph route or an image route? Because images can transpose between whatever language you want it to be. It's a kitchen sink.
Yeah, this was looked at in a previous stage of the project, and one of the problems that came out of it was that when you start showing people pictures, if their home doesn't look like the pictures, it kind of generates quite a bit of uncertainty, and they're not sure if they're doing the right thing. And actually, counterintuitively, they found words more easy to understand than pictures. But yeah, I take your point. You would think that pictures would work better.
It was also the scaling on the devices, so that most people reporting it from a mobile device, and I think that by the time they'd got the picture of the kitchen down to a 4-inch screen on an older iPhone or whatever, that it wasn't that legible, and so we started to run into accessibility issues as well, I think.
Cool. I think Faisal. You're muted, so.
It's Faisal from Newham. I sort of wanted to pick up on Jem's point about leaseholders having the ability to report repairs, communal repairs, and I think we're missing a trick over here. I mean, we've got an online form. It's a Northgate product called Interfinder, and tenants at present do report repairs through that form, and it flows through the system. the job itself. But we don't allow leaseholders to do it because we can't work this one out. With leaseholders, generally the least satisfied with our services that we provide, from the online, the annual satisfaction survey. I think it's an area to really look at, and it'll be something I'll be more than interested in if you can produce something there, because this is what they're craving for, and they generally have an issue with how they could contact us regarding repairs. So it's not something it's worth looking at. That's my opinion anyway.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's not worth looking at. It's more a question of, like, given like the complexity and the budget we've got, like kind of what's the most value we can deliver with kind of like the time and we've got available to us. Cool. Any more for any more? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending. It's great to get feedback on the project. We'll send out an invite for the next one in 2 weeks' time with slightly more notice than we were able to this week. And yeah, hopefully see you all again. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.